Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to handle one question before we move to John in Texas. What do the dots on the manure management slide mean? And I'll try to move
I should have visited that, but that was a stoplight, a traffic light, with the green being those are good practices. Columns 1 and 2. 1 actually would exceed NRCS standards. 2 generally would meet NRCS standards. 3 is basically caution. Depending on the watershed, that situation may be good enough, or again, like in a drinking water supply watershed, we might like to see a practice implemented that would move them into a 1 or 2 category, and of course 4 being red, we have an issue that we should be addressing.
All right. And Jeff, thanks so much. If you'll hang on the line for questions in a bit, there'll be more, I'm sure. It's my pleasure to introduce then our next speaker will be John, and while I swap out the slides for John's presentation from the great state of Texas, and we're going to learn about, from John, the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board's Water Quality Management Plan Certification Program. So John, while I swap into your slides, do you want to say a few words to the nice folks while I bring up your presentation?
Sure. You know, when this program that I'm going to go over here for the next 10 minutes was created back in the early 90s, the concept of certainty as it's being discussed here on the national stage wasn't really anything that anyone had thought of or had heard of. You know, at the start of a few years ago when we first started hearing about this, we said that sounds a lot like the program that we have, and there's probably a lot of similarities to the objectives and goals that most people are trying to get to with our program. But as you can imagine, you can go on to the next slide, you got a program around for 20 years, it tends to build up a little bit of bureaucracy. So I'm going to try and stick with the program elements that are really pertinent as far as demonstrating how we think this is applicable to a certainty concept, and stay away from the more technical aspects. We'd be here all day long talking about that, but the major program element, it is a conservation planning program. A participant does get a conservation plan. It's called a water quality management plan. Basically, that is going to include a conservation plan of operations and an implementation schedule and your usual maps and technical information, etc. It's that this program is really, I don't know what percentage of our participants are animal feeding operations, but we do have quite a number of them. We have in the neighborhood of 1,300 or 1,400 poultry operations. At one point in time, we did have several dozen small dairies, a few feedlots, but the economics of having feedlots that aren't the size that requires permits really aren't real conducive to having very many of those. So it is a non-point source program. It's administered by the State Soil and Water Conservation Board and through the local conservation district. Its goal is to install best management practices, conservation practices, and the objectives of the program are really water quality, water quantity, water conservation, and soil erosion prevention. The thing that it has in common with all the other programs we've really heard about is it is voluntary, and well, we do have one exception that I'll go into here in a little while. But the one thing that we've noticed that is extremely important is that we do have a cost share program that's tied to it to incentivize participation. In a voluntary program, what we found out is the status or special protection or certainty that you get under our water code in Texas just isn't really enough, given the environment that we're in right now, to garner participation in significant levels. You can go on to the next slide. The origin, motivation for the program, a lot was discussed as far as the runoff from waste application fields of CAFOs, both permitted and unpermitted. As EPA's regs evolved in the 90s and into the 2000s, it became clear that the footprint of a CAFO was going to include those, and so this program being non-point source, applicability of the permitting program and encompassing those waste application fields, really that kind of fell by the wayside. And so that was originally that was a motivating factor, but it became more of there just became a desire that there was a need for a voluntary program that would demonstrate that a regulatory program wasn't necessary on everything that did not have to have a permit through our state regulatory agency. The program was created in state law through Senate Bill 503 back in 1993 by the Texas legislature. In fact, it's most commonly referred to as the 503 program here in our state. It did several things. Made quite a few changes to the Texas Agriculture Code. It's Chapter 201, Section 26. If anybody wants to look that up, you can Google that here and find that on our Secretary of State's website. It basically said that the agricultural and silvicultural non-point source pollution activities, those type of activities, any non-point source pollution coming from those activities was under the jurisdiction of the State Soil Water Conservation Board. So it's very similar to the Ag Stormwater Exclusion provisions in the Clean Water Act. That put us into the water quality business in the state. It dragged us in direct relations with EPA. It created the program itself that we're talking about today. It loosely defines AFOs as a non-point source. It's not a real explicit thing, but the program does consider non-permitted CAFOs to be a non-point source facility, and they do qualify. That's by no means the only type of operations that we have. One thing I did want to mention is that there's been in the neighborhood of 10,000 participants in this program over the last 20 years. We're not real sure at this point exactly how many of them are still actively following their plan, but we do have a rolling program for checking on that that we're actually making some changes to here. That legislation got us in the 319 business, made us a co-administrator of our state's non-point source management program that involved us into the discussion as far as things like TNDLs, water quality standards establishment. We're certainly a player in that. They're the jurisdiction of our state regulatory agency, though. The most important or most impactful thing that this bill did was that in the Texas Water Code, it created an authorized discharge provision or unauthorized discharge provision. You can go on to the next slide as it's titled in our water code. But what basically it said is, except as authorized by the commission, which is our state regulatory agency, no person may, and if you jump down to number 2 there on the slide, discharge other waste, which is, if you go into the definition of our water code, that's where the non-point source pollution is basically defined. It's in fact, the definition of ag waste actually excludes this type of pollution. So anyway, it is basically not allowed unless it complies with a person's, and they added this to the water code, certified water quality management plan. And what that means is that any discharge that does occur even, let me put it this way, if the plan is being followed and it's being implemented and a discharge of any kind does occur, that it is authorized under law, much like a permit. And that was a key thing that gives these plans a special place in the Texas Water Code. You can go on to the next thing. As far as agency coordination, we do have a memorandum of understanding. It's been updated several times with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They are the delegated state regulatory agency for air, water, and waste in Texas. It deals with the resolution of complaints, and so there's if a complaint is filed against a non-point source entity, a non-permitted entity, there are protocols in place for the State Soil and Water Conservation Board and the local Soil and Water Conservation District to resolve that complaint without it becoming part of the enforcement compliance program down at TCQ. And in many cases, the development and implementation of a water quality management plan is the remedy for that if there is a valid issue. That MOU deals with other things like 319 funding coordination and other things like that we have to work on. But the gist of it is the interaction between the two agencies from a non-point source perspective, and the water quality management plan is usually the suggested remedy. You can go on to the next slide. One exception to the voluntary nature of this program in our state is that we've had state legislation filed back in 2001 that requires poultry operations to obtain and follow one of these plans. It's an interesting story. This actually what became a requirement due to air quality and odor complaints, but this program does address BMPs that help mitigate those types of things, and so it actually has helped in reducing the number of complaints that are filed for odor. But dry litter poultry operations are the ones that are generally it's understood that those are the things that the facilities that do fall under this provision, because most of all, well, in fact, all of our poultry facilities that use liquid waste handling systems in the state are permitted and fall under the other agency's jurisdiction. The MOU was recently revised with our regulatory partner to use a status review, which is an inspection that our agency performs on water quality management plans. Actually, that status review will count towards a CAFO inspection, because as a result of that waterkeeper ruling by the Second Circuit Court, I guess several years ago now, that it put in place that EPA could define dry litter poultry operations that don't intend to discharge as a CAFO. They couldn't require them to take a permit if they don't plan to discharge. Well, they're defined as CAFOs